I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. The words struck the chapel like a stone thrown through a pane. They did not belong there, among the low prayers and the rustle of coats. They were rough-hewn and sudden as a cliff face. Silas Boon stood in the center aisle like a thing come down from the hills, broad-shouldered, bearded, coat still bearing pine resin in the seams, eyes dark as river rock in winter. The bell in the small steeple had just finished its soft toll. The sun made the dust in the nave visible as a golden hush. People looked up. Children stopped rocking on their heels. Old men coughed and pretended not to. He had not meant to speak aloud. He had meant only to stand at the back and watch the farce of the morning, the auctioning of a neighbor's daughter to settle another man's ledger. He had meant to watch and go back up the ridge, but the words came out as if his throat had been a locked cabin door and something keyed the lock. I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. It was not a boast. It was confession and miracle and complaint all at once. It carried the hollow that had lived in him like an echo, the long winter of a man who had taught himself the edges of things and had learned his own hands better than any other voice. There was a softness under that tone, raw with need and shame, and when he stepped forward, it felt less like trespass and more like a pilgrimage. Clara Wynne sat on the third pew, her braid wrapped with a plain ribbon, her posture small but steady. She had come that morning with the slow, determined face of someone who had rehearsed her own helplessness until it became a shape she could walk in. Her father's name, Quiet Tom Wynne, was a ledger entry in Harold Fitzgerald's book. The Fitzgerald ledger smelled of grease and government paper, and the certainty of men who had learned to weigh souls in coin. Clara was here because the law of the town allowed it, because the sheriff had a conscience too thin, because debts gather like ivy and choke the best sorts. Silas walked until he was close enough to smell the candle tallow and Clara's lemon soap. He took her hand before anyone could raise a finger. The wordless permission in Clara's glance, flat, frightened, measuring, was not surrender but calculation. She would not be placed on a block and offered like a cow. Whatever the stranger proposed, she would make it into better odds than what Fitzgerald would buy with his smile. "Marry me," Silas said. The sentence lasted only a breath. There was no ceremony in his voice, only a hungry straightforwardness that surprised and frightened the room. He set his mouth to hers then, quick and fierce, a claim and a pledge. It was the sort of kiss that implied both rescue and reckoning. In the patchwork light of the church, with faces upturned in scandal and amazement, it smelled of tin cups and pine smoke and fear. The priest, Father Mackenzie, intervened with a voice that was more habit than strength. "We cannot," he began.
"They can," Harold Fitzgerald said from the front, all silk and a banker's certainty, his hand on the arm of his own polished watch. "This is a disturbance." "They can," echoed a murmur from the wooden benches, some in outrage, some in the small greedy hope that resettling a woman might unsettle a debt more cleanly than violence. Clara's eyes were level on Silas now. The hush of the chapel pressed around them like snow on a roof. "I will," she said. It was not an answer born of dazed obedience. It was a choice. She folded into the act like someone stepping into a cloak that would, for a time, keep her from the wind. There was bargaining in that single syllable, an agreement to a perilous and uncertain safety, and shock rippled through the room. Silas did not speak more. He took the priest's hand and made them wed with the half-mumbled words of a man who knew the shape of vows, even if he had not used them. He pressed his forehead to hers, and the chapel's rough boards felt as if they might split under the suddenness of it all. In the faces of the people, something like rumor leapt. The ledger-keeper clenched his jaw. Men shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing their complacency had been borrowed and might be recalled. Outside, the auction's cries faltered and then dwindled into a fitful, angry whisper. The square smelled of damp hay and horse sweat. People trailed from the doors, clustering into knots, trading versions of the moment the way one trades small coins. The Fitzgeralds of the town could not abide such unpredictability. They had built their power on the town's willingness to expect things to be the same weekday after weekday. Silas and Clara mounted a rugged mare that Silas called Mercy and rode toward the west road without a backward look. The road climbed like a question toward the ridge. It was lined with scrub and the occasional fence post leaning like an old man catching his breath. For the villagers left behind, the sight of them was a ragged picture. A mountain man with wild hair and a married woman with a stiff ribbon in her hair vanishing into the heat plain of the slope. They rode in silence most of the way, only the horse's breath and the creak of leather between them. Clara had not yet rearranged the life she had been living, bills, small household habits, the cold in her bones of nights spent alone. but she carried herself now with a different economy. She asked practical questions on the climb, about provisions, about water, about whether she might tend the small patch of garden Silas kept to one side of the cabin. His answers were simple, measured. He explained the cistern and the lean-to where he cured hides, the way to read the weather from the long gray on a pine's underleaf. He treated her as someone he meant to teach, and there was in that approach a kind of respect. He told her once, quietly, as the mare picked its way, how he had come to live on the ridge. "I came up after it went wrong," he said.
"I made a place to be anonymous. It was easier than asking forgiveness." "What went wrong?" she asked, because that was what she did. She asked questions like a person feeling for a seam in the earth. "Feuds don't feel like wrong at the start," he said. "They feel like defense. Men keep stakes, and the footing gets muddy. Names are called. Guns speak. I learned the cost." He did not offer the name Thomas Wynne. He did not, in that moment, name the man whose death had become a shadow over the ridge. There were certain old wounds he kept folded in the back of his neck like a winter cloth. The cabin was a neat thing made by careful hands, logs hewn and notched, the roof held by a throat of poles and moss, a small stone chimney that exhaled a steady column of smoke. It sat with its face to the valley, taking the worst of the wind, and a little garden where rows were kept short and straight enough to make Clara smile. Silas had made a bed with a rope frame and a mattress of recycled feather. He had shelves of tin, a battered copper kettle, a stacking of jars preserved with wax, and the careful hand of a man who could make few journeys, and therefore made each supply count. That first night, over coffee strengthened with blackstrap molasses and biscuits warmed on a pan, they learned the first terms of living together. Silas showed her the method for boiling water until the grit settled out. She showed him how to arrange a quilt with the fingers she had trained in hospital linens and borrowed books. When she spread the quilt out on her lap, she began to hum a tune, an old hymn or country air, half to herself and half to the house. Silas listened like a man hearing sea after a desert. There was no gentle comedy in his response, only a man who felt a hinge opening. The days that followed settled into a deliberate apprenticeship. Clara catalogued the cabin's silverware and found to her private amusement how precise he was about the placement of knives and the rows of spoons. She learned how to hang meat to cure, how to skim fat from a pot, how to start a fire when lightning had damped the kindling. He taught her how to use the rifle, the way to breathe so the barrel did not jiggle, the care of the iron so it would not betray its master. At first she fumbled, the stock too large for her hands, the powder stung her eyes. But she was an apt pupil. Her hands remembered patterns quickly, and within a few weeks she could break clay targets with a shot that surprised even Silas. They traded memories in fragments, small peculiar confidences rather than stories meant to smooth over the past. She told him of a bakery in Cedar Falls that had once been her favorite, where the woman who owned it had a laugh like a bell and gave her day-old rolls for pennies. He told her of a winter where he'd gone 2 days without food and had eaten pine buds to keep the worst hunger away. They spoke of nothing, and it felled some of the monstrous loneliness that had lodged in Silas's ribs. At nights, Silas would look at her and think of the 10-year chaunt, like a ledger he had never closed. He had not seen a woman's face for a decade, no warmth in the bedroll, no hand on his shoulder at midnight. The rock in him had cracked when he kissed her in the chapel. That silence was not simply absence, but a yearning he had learned to measure in the weight of things he had taken to himself. He had killed, yes, once, and perhaps more, because the hills had taught him that mercy was a currency he could not afford. The memory of that other man's blood smelled in him sometimes like cedar sap, bitter and sticky. He did not tell her all of that at once. He gave his truth in parts, like a man doling out flint to a fire. Meanwhile, in Cedar Falls, the ledger at Fitzgerald's office grew ragged at its edges, and the man who liked to preserve things abundant, watches, deeds, the knowledge of what another owed, felt the outrage of the affront. That morning in the chapel had cracked him like a knuckle. He had expected to buy the town's compliances as one buys anything, with a sum, a favor, a smile. Instead, a man had walked off with her, and his ledger was left with a blank space and a red mark. Fitzgerald did not move immediately to violent retribution. He moved in coincidence and paper. He sent a terse letter to the sheriff about a missing person who had been taken by a lawless element. He paid an extra hand to put up a poster that would flutter in every wind. He whispered in the salon where town mothers gathered that propriety had been violated, that a precedent had been set. and in small ways he began to undermine them. A few shipments of supplies were slowed. The people in town who depended on his grain credit found the terms harder. His reach was long. Silas kept to the ridge mostly, but he could not pretend the world of the valley had failed to notice. A man could not marry in a church and then vanish entirely without tongues wagging. He read those tongues when he visited down for a sack of flour, faces that had been neutral now cocked into suspicion, shopkeepers whose eyes lingered on his hands as if expecting some sign of guilt. He had not thought to be a spectacle again. Still, there were times when he would stand on his porch and listen, the sound of the town like a distant river, and wonder whether coming down had been a mistake. Clara, for her part, made the mountain into a small world to conquer. She took to the garden like someone mending a net, rooting out thistles, saving seeds, asking questions the way she made lists in her head. She kept the little Spartan rooms tidy and brought a human shape to the space that had been a man's reserve. She found, tucked behind a loose plank in the floor where Silas had kept leather and a journal, a small trunk with an old yellowing letter tied in twine.
The paper had a dark smear across the bottom, like dried ink made of rust. On a rain-soft afternoon, as thunder found its voice in the hills, Clara sat cross-legged on the floorboards and untied the string. The letter was brittle and written in a small, cramped hand. It was not addressed to her. It had been folded in a way that was meant to conceal, not preserve. The corner of the page bore a notation that set her throat tightening. Thomas Wine. His death will be made to look like accident. The words were plain enough. The signature at the bottom was not a neat flourish, but hurried. H. Fitzgerald. She read it twice, and on the second read, the stain at the bottom of the page glowed like a bruise. Someone had pressed blood to paper. The idea of blood transposed onto ledger paper made something in Clara's stomach drop like a stone into cold water. This was not merely piling debt upon debt. This was a direction, a plan, and beneath it the kind of culpability that turned acquaintances into felons. For a long time she simply sat with the letter in her hands, listening to the rain on the roof. It was one thing to sense the Fitzgerald man's cruelty in the way he spoke. It was another to hold a line he'd put to paper that tied him to the death of another neighbor. Thomas Wine had been an honest man, formerly of the Inlet Road. Rumor said he'd fallen from a scaffold when he passed through work on a new lumber hold. The town had called it a misfortune. The letter called it planned. When she slid the paper back into the trunk, she felt as if she'd closed a lid on a rattling thing inside her. She knew what the letter meant, that return to the valley would not be a quiet matter. Evidence like this, if shown in the right place, could topple a man. But evidence like this also burns the hands that hold it and draws men to blood. She took the letter to Silas before she made any decisions. He was on the stoop whittling a spoon, the curl of wood shaving like a ribbon. He watched her come and let the tin cup on his knee grow heavy with no attempt at conversation. "There are many kinds of danger," he said when she did not speak immediately. "There are the kinds you can see and the kinds you can smell heavy on the air. Which is this?" She laid the paper between them on his palm. He read it without the scandal of a town square, the lines in his face sharpening. The mountain taught him a certain economy of response. Here was a tool, and here was its use. "This is why he pays in kindness," Silas said. "This is why men like him wear smiles like a second skin." Clara looked at him, not as a supplicant, but like someone considering whether to strike her fate into the ground or hold her hand out for it. "We could take it to town," she said. "Judge Harrison, he's fair. He would listen." Silas's mouth tightened. The word "we" surprised him. It was not a pronoun he was accustomed to hearing attached to his life. He had been a solitary thing so long, the idea of partnership felt like a strange animal in the parlor. He thought of walking into a courthouse with a paper that bore the Fitzgerald name, of the man in satin cuffs folding his hands and feigning injury. He thought of the wanted posters and the men with their coarse belts. He thought of the bell tower and the way his own life might be measured against a rope. "Or we could bury the paper and pretend nothing's changed," he said. "No." Her voice had the steadiness of someone who had spent a long time calculating and had chosen a risky freedom over a safer complacency. "If we bury this, others die. If we carry it, we might lose everything, but at least it is a chance. I would rather lose with my eyes open." The admission landed between them like a pact. Silas looked at her for a long time, measuring the courage that had become a soft light inside of her. He thought of his 10 years above the town,
the solitude that had hardened into a shell, the reputation that visited like a rumor. He did not say the things that would have excused his delay in coming down, the grudges that had calmed into a weary smoke, the nights he had waited for retribution and found only the cold. He let her speak the decision into being, and then held her hand as if to anchor himself to the answer. "Then we'll go," he said at last. "We go slow. We go where the law can see us, to Judge Harrison. We do not walk into a trap." There was a plan begun in the kitchen that evening, what to bring, how to keep their trail less obvious, which friends in Cedar Falls they could trust. Silas wrote nothing down. His memory was ledger and stone, but they outlined routes and contingencies as if mapping an old engine. Clara insisted on taking a leather folder with the letter inside, and Silas hid it in the lining of her satchel, like a secret bird. The mountain did not give up its weather. A few days after the letter's discovery, clouds came with a quick, violent honesty. The road to Cedar Falls would be treacherous when mud pulled at wheel and hoof alike. A town like Cedar Falls expected winter to keep certain men bottled up. Men like Silas were meant to be romantic threats, not men who walked into courtrooms with a letter that smelled of old sins. They packed at dawn, the world bone white with frost. They left a note inaudible to most, a small care package on the table, a bowl of warm oats for Mercy. Silas looked at the valley as they descended, the town a small eddy in a large world, and for a moment he tasted the possible consequence of his own defiance. He tasted loss, and also the strange, warming flavor of hope. On the way down they met a rider on the road, a man with a ledger-stitched hat and a face like a stone left too long in the sun. He carried a poster rolled and tied with string. When he saw Silas, his hand tightened on the paper as if the weight of the world had been transferred to his grip. "You Boon," the writer called.
The word had an edge in it. News travels quick as wind in a hollow. "There's talk in the town you took a woman." "A woman chose," Clara said, shading the writer with her hand as if sheltering a fragile promise. The writer's face shifted, a small confusion between recognition and annoyance. "There's a reward out," he said. The phrase landed with a flatness that made the horse's ears prick. "For any man who brings word of Silas Boon." Silas said nothing for a long moment. He felt the old ledger of the valley tilt toward them, balance on one thin edge. The ride continued with a deliberate caution. The world was not yet undone, but the scaffolding had weakened. Clara felt it too, not as fear alone, but as the metallic taste of responsibility. She had chosen the route that led back into the town's face, and with that choice, she had also chosen to place herself where men like Fitzgerald had power. They camped that night under a sky cut with bright, indifferent stars. The wind moved through the needles like a hand through hair. Silas kept the rifle close, not for the town or the law, but for the sense that there were old debts waiting in hollow places, and that sometimes the past followed men like a stray dog who would not be sent away. Clara spread the letter on her knees under the lantern's glow. The stain at its corner looked black in the thin light. "We should plan who to tell," she said. "Judge Harrison, yes. There are others, Sarah Morrison's mother, Jacob, if he were alive. We need someone who owes loyalty to truth, not business." She hesitated on Jacob's name. Jacob Morrison had been a clerk, a night man at the warehouse who had kept records in his pockets and secrets in the seam of his coat. He had died under odd circumstances, fell from a loft, the story said, leaving a daughter named Sarah whose youth had been auctioned in the square a week before Clara had been placed on the block. The memory of that morning had not left her. Sarah's face, pale and alarmed, had been like a mirror of Clara's own. Some truths kept returning in different skims. "We will go to Judge Harrison," Son said. "He listens. He takes paper seriously. He remembers that a town is not a bank for men who want to own everything." Clara folded the letter and slid it back into the folder. "We tell him everything," she said. "We'll tell him who we believe Jacob was. We'll tell him about Sarah. We'll tell him about the auction. We will speak loud enough so it cannot be reduced to rumor again." Silas's jaw tightened. "The law is a good thing until it isn't," he said, "until men twist it and bend it." And when men twist it, Clara replied, "We hold it up to the light so it shows its cracks." They settled that night with a quiet agreement. It was small and domestic and dangerously fragile, like the first stitch in a quilt. They would go to town and speak to Judge Harrison. They would lay the letter on his desk and ask him to see it. They would do this in daylight, under the law's eye, so that if men moved against them, they would move with the knowledge that their act was recorded. There were practical matters: whom to trust, which roads to avoid, what plausible reason they could give for their presence in town should someone ask. Silas knew the faces that bought and sold favors in Cedar Falls. He knew silent conspirators and those who kept their conscience in their pocket. He had been a mountain man long enough to believe weather and fate were less predictable than the ledger men, yet he had been forged by both caution and an unquiet heart. In the morning, they rode down through a fog that turned the world gauze thin. The valley opened before them like a map. Cedar Falls lay in the bowl below, smoke rising in a thin column from chimneys, its streets like arteries in a living thing. The townspeople watched them approach with a curious, brittle silence. The poster the writer had mentioned fluttered on a lamppost in front of the general store. Silas' tousled hair white at the edges, like a man whose name was a thing on a list. The poster's edges were weathered, its ink a bold proclamation, reward for information leading to Silas Boon. Silas stopped and touched the paper with a fingertip, as if testing whether the town itself would flinch. He was not used to being the subject of commerce. Clara watched him, feeling her pulse align with his, in a way that made her chest ache like a drum. When they reached Judge Harrison's office, they found the man already at his desk, spectacles low on his nose, the authority of someone who had spent a life holding other people's reckonings. He received them with a mix of caution and the dignity of someone who had grown used to being asked to adjudicate more than was good for any one man's conscience. They told him the story. Clara did most of the speaking, and she placed the letter on the desk between them. The judge read it, his face unreadable at first. He adjusted his spectacles, and then, like a man weighing a scale, he reached for the city records to cross-check. There was a gravity in his movement that made Silas think of a man removing a burden. "This is serious," Judge Harrison said at last. "If this document holds, there are grounds for inquiry. I will issue warrants if the evidence holds up, and if we can corroborate. You two will need to give testimony." Clara's voice was steady as she answered. "I will," she said. "I will tell what I saw and where I found this paper." Silas, watching her, felt a lightness that frightened him. Her resolve was a lever. It made him both proud and afraid. He was a man who had learned to measure his life by what he had lost, and here she was naming what should be sought. "Do not think this will be clean," Judge Harrison warned. "Men who believe their place is absolute do not yield easily, but the law will act where there is paper and witnesses and a judge willing to sign warrants." He signed with a deliberate hand. The ink was the thin black line of civility. For the first time since the chapel, a public legal machinery began to take up the case. Outside, as they stepped into the light, the lamplighter, an old friend to the town, nodded in silence. A boy on the corner laughed too loud at nothing. The poster fluttered like a challenge. Silas felt the weight of many eyes settle on him. As they left the courthouse, a figure stepped from the shadow near the bakery, an old woman with the steady stoop of someone who had watched towns rise and fall. She held out a hand to Clara, fingers like knotted roots. "Be careful," she said, with a compassion that did not need to be loud. "There are men who buy and sell more than livestock down here. They deal in people's lives." Clara nodded as if she had expected the warning and had already counted it among the costs. Silas folded the warning into his ledger of risk. The world had been irrevocably altered by the simple action of a man who had said he had not seen a woman in 10 years. What had been a private hunger now had a public consequence. They left Cedar Falls that day with the judge's promise like a cloak on their shoulders and a new fear blooming in the valley air. Men had already started to talk about the audacity of a mountain man and a young woman bringing a paper that named a powerful banker. Some of that talk would be supportive. Much of it would be the cold calculus of men who stood to lose from the truth being pulled out into the light. On the way back up the ridge, Clara rode with the letter folded beneath her hand. She pressed it to her chest as if to feel its shape. Silas rode beside her like someone guarding a fragile thing not just from enemies, but from his own old reflexes. The mountain welcomed them with its old, uncompromising weather, winds that cleaned the air and left everything more honest. And for a while they sat in the solemn hush of a place that expected people to answer for themselves. That night, as rain hammered the roof and the world narrowed to the circle of lantern light, they shared a small supper. They spoke of contingencies and of what to do if men came up the road. They spoke also of small and tender things, the quilt in progress, the way the kettle sang a tune, and these details took the edges off the dread. Later, when the house settled and the wind went to sleep in the pines, Silas stood by the open window and watched the valley shadowed like a bowl of ink. He felt the eyes of Cedar Falls on him in a way he had not felt since younger days, when guns and grudges had been a kind of currency. He had taken a woman from a public platform and had spoken aloud a truth about himself that made him vulnerable. He had thought himself ready to pay the price. The cost, it seemed, might be higher than he had guessed.
Clara sat at the table, needle moving through calico, stitching a pattern that blended old city designs with the harsh geometry of the mountain. The motion calmed her. She had made decisions that morning that would change the lives of many. There was fear in that, but there was no regret. The fold of the letter had burnished with use. The stain at its corner seemed almost an accusation in ink. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked finally. Silas did not answer at once. He turned to look at her, measuring the woman who had become his partner in action. "Men come when they think they can profit," he said, "and men come when they think they can punish. Both sorts will test us." She did not flinch. "Let them test," she said. "We have the law now. We have paper and witnesses. We have each other." He wanted to laugh then, a sound like a twig snapping. A laugh was as dangerous as prayer on that ridge. He swallowed it down and put his hand over hers, a small human proof of permanence. Outside, the wind rose again, a low and patient voice. The mountain exhaled. In the distance, Cedar Falls hunched against its own uncertainties, and in both places, an unsteady thing called hope had been put into motion. They went to bed both with the same restless thought. A man who had said, in a chapel, that he had not seen a woman in 10 years had altered more than 2 lives. He had set a town thinking. He had set a judge in motion. He had forced the ledger to reveal a bloodstain. Dawn the next day was a blue, hard thing, and men in town began to move like cogs. The postering had increased. The reward had become the rumor that made strangers linger long enough to be men of rumor. The sheriff's deputy had done what deputies usually did, measured distance and duty. Notices were posted in markets and blacksmith shops, and somewhere in the river bend, a man with a sour look took down the name of Silas Boon with the intent of selling it to the highest bidder. Silas and Clara moved through the morning with the compact silence of people who had covenanted with danger. They worked the garden, they fixed a loose board. At midday, a stranger came down the lane, bent shoulders and a wasteful stare, carrying a parcel that smelled of ink and something like old coal. He knocked on the cabin door and handed them a note from town. "It says," he said, "that a man named Vincent Kellerman has put his name down to come by tomorrow. He says he wants to speak to Silas." Silas took the paper with hands that did not tremble. Vincent Kellerman, the name arrived like a memory's echo. He was the son of a family whose feud had once made the valley ring with bad blood. Silas's jaw tightened. Kellerman's name had always marked a visit that busied itself with unfinished business. "Tell him we're not looking for trouble," Clara said. The words left the house gently, but with a steel wire inside them. "Tell him if he comes, he will find us in the light." The man left, taking the note with him, and the cabin became, for a moment, a small island in a wide sea of expectations. Silas sat down at the table and looked at Clara. "You know why he would come?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "He comes for old things, sometimes to settle them, sometimes to make sure they stay unsettled." He nodded. He had once known the shape of Kellerman's anger intimately. It was a slow, patient thing that could be kept in a family like a tool. He understood the danger of an uncried feud, of a son taking up an old score as if it were his right. He had in his past answered with blows and blood. That life had cost him friends and sleep and a sense of self that had hardened into a survival streak. The mountain had been his exile and his teacher, and he did not want to be dragged back into the old currency of violence. But the valley was not likely to stay inert. A letter with a bloodstain had landed in the judge's hands. Names had been called. Men would test boundaries. The next days would show whether Cedar Falls could do what a courthouse promises, take a wrong and set the mind of men to reckon with it fairly, or whether the town would prefer old comforts. Silas rose from the table and went outside to stand by the garden. He watched Mercy stir in her stall and the wind scold the shirts on the line. He thought of the 10-year tally and how it had felt like a sentence. He had spoken the truth, and now the truth had moved. There would be consequences,
and some of them might be bright as justice. Some of them might be dark as revenge. Clara came to stand with him. She set the letter on the table and put a stir of tea between them. "Whatever comes," she said, "we face it together." There was no theatricality in her voice, only a resolute daily courage. He put his hand over hers. "Together," he said. For the first time in a long time, the mountain did not feel like only walls. It felt like a base. And as winds rose down in the valley and men readied themselves, the two of them turned toward what they had set in motion, not as a pair of strangers, but as partners in a reckoning that would demand more of them than any initial choice had implied. When night fell, they heard the distant roll of hooves and the faint sound of voices in the valley. The poster on the general store had been taken down, replaced by another offering a larger reward, and men in hats began to look at the ridge as if it were an animal to be hunted. The candle burned low in the cabin, and the quilt on the bed grew stitch by stitch into its pattern. Clara lay awake, thinking of the child she might one day keep in her arms, thinking of the cradle she had seen once in a shop window, and would now dream of making herself. Silas slept fitfully, the past sometimes intruding like a cold that woke him.
He dreamed of the chapel, of his words being a confession and a promise, and of the delicate, complicated thing that is trust, grown slowly, tended carefully, never forced. In the morning, they would march back to the valley if need be. They would carry paper before them and the law behind them. They would face Vincent Kellerman and Harold Fitzgerald's men if they were sent. But for the moment, the world on the ridge was a measured thing, and a woman who had brought order to a roof that had known only rough shelter. She had stitched a life into his cabin as if mending a hole in a coat. She had made the place speak of women and children and ordinary mornings. And the thought of that ordinary life, of bread warmed on a pan, of a cradle carved by patient hands, kept her steady when the valley's shadow leaned in. They did not have long before the valley acted. Word moves down slopes as fast as water, and men in town began to gather the loose ends of rumor and stitch them into a cloth of purpose. Riders came and went at odd hours. A mercenary or two, ambitious and thin, drifted through Cedar Falls, looking for any man whose name was worth a reward. Harold Fitzgerald tightened his smile and wrote letters with a steady hand. He courted allies in the saloons and in the pews with gifts and with the soft art of reminding men what they owed him. One late morning, a rider with the bark of bad weather in his cheeks brought a second note. Silas unfolded it with fingers that remembered long winters. The handwriting was a mixture of furious loops and a son's impatience. Vincent Kellerman will visit tomorrow to settle things with Boon. He had added a postscript that read like a dare. Silas read the note and folded it without comment. He had spent the better part of a life learning the shape of Kellerman anger. It was not a rage that leapt and vanished. It settled like frost and ate at the seams of a man's life until something broke. Vincent was a difficult man because he had learned his father's grievances as if they were heirlooms. He did not forgive easily. He had reasons beyond logic for seeing Silas as a threat. Old blood songs that told young men their proof of manhood lay in settling scores. Clara listened to the wind at the eaves and then to Silas as he spoke. "He'll come looking for an answer he thinks is owed," Silas said. "We cannot pretend that will not be violent, but I do not want to teach a child to measure life by the currency of revenge." "We won't let violence define us," Clara answered. "We'll face it, but I won't make a life by carrying another man's grudge." Her voice had the hard clarity of someone who had balanced risk and decided to shoulder it rather than hide. They planned, not an elaborate war plan. This was not the business of men with armies, but the quiet, practical arrangements that steady ordinary courage. They stocked food and placed a bell in the rafters to warn of night visitors. They apprenticed Sarah Morrison at a distance. Sarah, who had been at the auction and whose life had been reshaped by the town's buying and selling, had found work as a seamstress in a house 2 miles down the road. Clara sent a small note with a coin for the girl and a request. "Listen at the market, watch the men who speak too much about rewards, and tell us if Fitzgerald's men are moving openly." Sarah sent back a response with the kind of bravery you find in young hands. She would watch and she would speak if she saw anything. She had a way, Clara knew, of becoming invisible in the right rooms, an essential talent in a town that preferred to look away. There was another line of work that required a different kind of courage: evidence. The letter had been damning, yes, but its weight would be greater if bound with corroboration. Jacob Morrison had been a clerk and a night man. He kept paper like a man keeps breath. Quiet, necessary. If Jacob had suspected a plan, he had likely hidden something more than a single note. They began to search the small trunk where Jacob had kept his few possessions, hoping for lists, for dates, for some ledger print that matched the handwriting of Harold Fitzgerald's man of paper. Clara found a clue not in the trunk but in Jacob's habit. He liked to hide things where workmen would not think to look, behind loose floorboards, inside the false bottom of a tobacco tin, beneath the wane of an unused counting machine. On the third try, she found a folded map of the old mine tunnels that ran like a forgotten skeleton under Cedar Falls. Jacob had marked a spot near the wharf with a small, careful ink cross. Beside the cross were the initials JM and a neat instruction: safe, ledger. The map had been hidden in the seam of an apron. Clara sat on the cabin floor with the map spread across her knees and the kettle whispering above them. "These tunnels," she said slowly, "are how Jacob moved at night. He was close to things men in daylight would never see. If there's a ledger, this map is where it might be." Silas leaned over the paper and traced the route with a finger the way a man traces the grain of wood. Jacob kept his life in places no one expected to look. "We can go there. We should." "Alone?" she asked, her face set with a look Silas had learned to recognize. Not a question so much as a measuring of risk. "If I go, they will think a woman is too foolish or too weak to be worth following. I'll blend. I'll move like a seamstress and meet the judge quietly with what I find. You create room. Make them look where you wish." He did not need to be told twice. The plan was in truth a perfect conjunction of what both could afford: Clara's smallness in the public eye, Silas's capacity to draw attention. They prepared in secret. Clara wrapped the letter and Jacob's map in oilcloth, tucked them into her satchel with a small loaf of bread, and dressed in a plain dress that would render her unremarkable in Cedar Falls. She practiced walking with the satchel slung as if it were a bag of knitting. She practiced the stoop of a woman who had nothing to hide but also nothing to spare. When she left the cabin, Mercy tethered to a post, she felt like a single stitch in a quilt that might yet hold. Before she went, Judge Harrison insisted on instituting a formal request for protections. He could not, in the privacy of a judge's conscience, simply send men unsupervised into dangerous places. He arranged for a minimal escort of deputies, Marshal Carter among them, to be posted at key points in town. Carter was a man of middling stature and ambiguous reputation. He had in his service an eye for order and a loyalty that sometimes bent with the wind. He promised, on the record, to keep the courthouse doors open and to ensure that anyone giving testimony would not be intercepted. Clara moved to Cedar Falls late at dusk, with the cautious step of someone who knows the value of shadows. She kept to the alleys that smelled of boiled beans and coal smoke. She found the opening to the old mine behind the lumberyard, a small doorway hidden by a stack of rejected planks. The air that came out of it smelled of earth and damp and old iron. She lit a small lantern, folded the map to the crossing, and climbed inside. The tunnels were a world apart, a place where the town above became a muffled heart and where progress could be measured by the drip of water on stone. The walls held echoes like a book holds memory. Footsteps sounded like distant thunder. Clara moved carefully, her lantern painting the stone in small, bright circles. She kept her hand on the wall to steady herself and to feel the history of human touch there. She thought of Jacob walking these passages at night, carrying ink on his clothes and secrets in his pockets. She thought of the way a man protects his ledger as he protects his own life. At the place Jacob had marked, she found a small iron box wedged under a beam. It took both hands to pull it free. The lock was stiff, and she worked it with a small pocket knife until the lid gave with a sigh. Inside were papers in a neat stack, ledgers with edges nicked by coal dust, receipts with dates and details, a page torn out and later stitched back with a thread of twine. She felt as she ran her fingers over the handwriting, the breath of a dead man's care. One ledger bore a heading in Harold Fitzgerald's careful hand. Entries listed shipments and payments, but beneath those entries were notations, payments recorded against names, and one line that made Clara's stomach go cold. Payment for removal, Thomas Wynne, $50. The ink had been blotted hastily on the margin. Other entries detailed favor payments to men who worked at the docks, and to a contractor who had arranged scaffolding. These were not the idle scribbles of a man keeping a tidy business. They were the neat record of a man who had decided to turn human action into invoices. She took nothing that could be ripped from its context and decided instead to fold the papers and keep them close. Her hand trembled only once. The ledger was the proof they needed, a chain of commerce that led straight from Fitzgerald to the act that had ended Thomas Wynne's life. Here, in the dark underbelly of the town, Jacob's work lived, a testament that could not be bribed into silence without consequence. She pressed her palm to the cold metal of the box and whispered a small thanks to a man who had kept truths like lit candles in the night. Then she made her way back the way she had come, the lantern's light like a pulse as she moved through the guts of the town toward Judge Harrison's office. Outside, the air had cooled, and the lights in the windows burned like distant stars.
Clara huddled into her shawl and pushed open the small door to the judge's chambers, where the judge sat up with papers before him, spectacles fogged with the concern of a man willing to be the slow hand of law. "You're late," he said softly, not in reprimand, but in recognition. He took the papers she put on the desk with an economy that felt both solemn and humane. "These are the things that can pull a man like Fitzgerald down. Where did you find them?" "In the tunnels," she said, and told the judge the route, the iron box, Jacob's mark. She spoke without embellishment, because her life was not the sort to profit from drama. The judge read with the small, deliberate movements of a man who pries open problems like a surgeon. "I will need these copied and sworn to," he said finally. "We will issue warrants at dawn. I cannot move on ink alone without traceable chain and witnesses. You will stand in court, Miss Wynne, and tell where you found these, and we will ask Marshal Carter's men to hold the line tonight." Clara nodded. "I'll stand," she said, "and tell whatever is asked." When she stepped back into the night, the town felt colder than it had when she went into the tunnels. She walked the alleys the way someone returns from a long undersea trip. Everything was sharper, and she had a new weight in her satchel. The judge had promised warrants, had committed his authority to their cause, actments that in a town like Cedar Falls made ink a weapon in the hands of people who wanted to know what actually had happened. Silas, waiting outside the inn on a bench that had once held busier men, saw her approach and rose with a brusque relief. He took the satchel from her with a quick, grateful clench. "You did well," he said, voice low enough only she could hear. There was pride in his tone, yes, but also a tremor of fear. He had watched her go underground and had not been able to follow. He had felt the way the dark could take hold of even small courage and leave no trace. "We have something that will make Fitzgerald stop pretending," Clara said. "We have his hands on paper and we have the judge on ink. The rest falls to law."
"And to men who do not like being told they are criminals," Silas replied. He did not mean only Fitzgerald. He meant the men who made fortunes on the comfortable ritual of making townspeople owe more than their lives. "Tonight I will make sure the town remembers the mountain is not simply a place that takes men. Sometimes it is a place that gives them back." His diversion was a simple, blunt thing. He rode into the square where Fitzgerald kept his store and arranged, with the help of a few men who still believed in the old code of neighborliness, a loud and public quarrel with men who would be sure to answer to a call for protection. Silas knew the town's thirst for spectacle. He offered one. He let word go out, deliberately leaked, that a man on the ridge had been seen threatening vendors. It was half truth and half bait. It drew attention like iron filings to a magnet. Fitzgerald's hired men took the bait with a furious enthusiasm. They drew pistols to put down and imagine trouble, and in their zeal, they left other places less guarded. At dusk, while a confused cluster of men argued loudly in the square over Silas's supposed threats, Clara slipped into the courthouse with the papers in her hand and the judge behind closed doors. Judge Harrison sat with the ledger and the other documents spread between them, and the candle burned with a solemn, thin light. He read aloud excerpts into a small notebook, as if to make them live in the air. "We will sign warrants," he said at length, his voice steady enough to hold up against doubt. "But this must be swift. We must serve them before those men can gather to flee." The secretary took the warrants and sealed them. Outside, the town square roiled of the staged commotion Silas had caused. He walked the alleys like a man with a purpose. He stood where he could be seen, at the edge of the mob, and let himself be the center of attention. He felt the old animal in him waiting to act without law, but he breathed and held to the plan. He needed the law to strike, because victory without law cheapened everything he had been trying to build with Clara. The night that followed is not the kind of dark suited for glorious tale. It was a messy, honest thing. Gunfire, shouted names, the reek of fear. Fitzgerald's hired men moved in a flurry to close ranks and protect the man they believed could pay them. Silas stepped into the middle of it, and with the lean, desperate courage of someone defending a life rather than a ledger, he fought. He did not glorify his blows. He used them to shield and to make room for law to arrive. Marshal Carter and his deputies, who had been wary at first of getting entangled with the Fitzgerald machine, arrived when told the situation had become volatile. When Carter saw the tangible proof of the men's violence, showed by a tossed pistol and the cracked bell in the square, he understood that law could not be bent on the side of the rich.
He called out the warrants and, with Judge Harrison's signed papers now in hand, directed men to hold Fitzgerald's house. Carter's alignment was not sudden righteousness. It was a pragmatic understanding that his oath was worth more than his convenience. He turned his authority, finally, to the side of order. The hired guns resisted. There were shots exchanged, men taking cover behind barrels and beneath awnings, the night filled with the quick fire of stubborn, frightened men. Silas, hand raw and honest, took part in the skirmish. He was not a creature of bravado. He was a man whose life had been bent by necessity into swift, rough competence. He used the cover of shadow and the old familiarity of the town's back alleys to keep the better-armed men on edge. At some point amid the confusion, a shout went up. Someone, no one could later say the exact name, had set fire to a storeroom to draw men away. It was an act that would later be claimed by rumor and denied by sober men. In the turmoil, a figure was seen crossing the bell tower. The bell clanged wildly, not as a call to worship now, but as an alarm. Silas, who had climbed the narrow stairs to the bell, felt the old pulse of danger in his veins and struck with a blunt, decisive force when an armed man made the mistake of stepping into the light. When the dust settled and the last of the hired men either lay subdued or fled, the town smelled of smoke and fear like a wound that had been cleaned. People stood in doorways and measured the day with cautious eyes. A few men had been hurt, bruises, a broken arm here and there, but none had been killed in the public exchange. The shame of that would be carried in the days to come by some and denied by others. Silas was not found among the living in the same way people might expect. He had been seen last climbing down from the bell tower into a back street, smeared with ash. Witnesses said he had been struck once with a blunt butt of a pistol and had fallen into the dark. When men searched the alleys after dawn, his footprints stopped by the riverbank. Some said he had been carried off. Others whispered that he had been taken by the mountain. Clara, who had been in the courthouse, as Judge Harrison read the warrants and issued arrest papers, felt the room shrink when a breathless messenger told of Silas's disappearance. The warrants were served at first light. Fitzgerald, roused in his house and woken by the knock of deputies whose badges were now an echo of Judge Harrison's ink, attempted protest and argument and all the practiced theater of a man who believed his paper could stop a gun. But law, once marshaled and backed by clear evidence and the judge's sway, had teeth. The ledgers from Jacob's box had been copied and were read in the presence of witnesses. Sarah Morrison was brought in, trembling but with steady eyes. She recognized Jacob's hand and spoke of his late-night comings and the ledger he had kept.
Father Mackenzie, who had been at the chapel the morning of Clara's sale, spoke under oath of the auction and of his unease with its legality. It was a litany of ordinary facts that, put together, made an extraordinary case. Harold Fitzgerald protested, of course. He spoke of errors and of business necessaries, and of men who were jealous of his success. He called names and attempted to sway jurors with the music of his wealth. But a ledger is stubborn. The payment marked for Thomas Wine's removal was not something that could be read as metaphor. The judge had the warrants. The deputies had men to cuff. Fitzgerald was led away in the full scrutiny of a town that watched the man who once bought favors leave in handcuffs. In the business of law, mornings can feel like theater. Men sat at the courthouse window and watched the procession. For some, this was the first time they had seen a man of standing led from his house in disgrace. For others, it was the uncomfortable, clarifying moment when they had to decide what to do with their own conscience. Silas, meanwhile, had not been taken off the stage without leaving a mark. He had been bruised and knocked, and for a while the rumor that he had been captured and left for dead spread through the streets like a cold wind. Clara could not be in two places at once. She was in the courtroom giving testimony when a ragged, frightened young man pushed his way in with the news that a stranger had been seen dragging a figure toward the river. Her hands shook for a moment, then steadied. "I will find him," she said simply, and the judge nodded because he had watched her be the kind of person who kept promises she made to others and to herself. They searched. Sarah's networks in the town turned up a man who had seen the shadow cross a back lane, and another who had glimpsed a coat snagged on a thorn by the riverside. A party of men, guided by the map Silas once made in his memory of the town, and by the sense that he would not go quietly, combed the banks. In time they found him, not dead but unconscious beneath a crude lean-to, his beard frozen at the edges of his face as if the river's breath had tried to claim him. He was alive, and the sight of his battered but breathing chest made the people with him, men who had been prone to silence, speak aloud their relief in a way that startled them. Clara knelt at his side and felt his palm, hard as wood and warm. He came back slow as a tide. The time between the dark where he had been struck and the light where he now lay was an odd, elastic thing. He groaned and then opened his eyes and saw her face. The sight, she could tell, was an opening. "You came," he said, voice a rough thread. "I did," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer placed the mountain and the court and the bell tower into a single human scale. "You fought so that the law could move. You didn't let him buy his way out." He smiled a small, private smile. "We did it better than money," he said, and then stopped himself with a cough. They sat for a while on the riverbank, with the morning sun keeping them honest. Around them, the town adjusted to a new order. Fitzgerald had been taken to the lockup, bound for a hearing. The hired men, many of whom had faced judge and jury with sweaty palms, muttered about bad luck and about the unfairness of a world that could not be bought. Some found themselves forced to consider their conscience. Others slunk back into the distance of men who always had work when things were easy. Clara's testimony was necessary and precise. She stood in the courthouse and spoke of the letter, of the tunnels, of Jacob's ledger, and of where she had found the papers. She answered the judge's questions with the plainness of someone who preferred truth to theater. When Father Mackenzie swore her in and she put her hand on the Bible, her voice did not waver. The courtroom listened, and then, after the formalities, the judge ordered further hearings. For once, paper and testimony conjoined into an instrument that the town could not ignore. The trial that followed was not an instant of catharsis, but a slow, sober unspooling. Evidence was presented. Witnesses took the stand. Jacob's ledger was a central piece. Its pages read like a ledger of intention and consequence, and the ink traced a path from a man of money to a man who died in a hole whose hands had been greased. Fitzgerald's defense appealed to business complexities and the difficulty of sorting human motive and human error. But the ledger's neat accounting, corroborated by Sarah and by other witnesses who remembered seeing contractors and scaffolding at the times in question, made a coherent narrative. Vincent Kellerman watched from the back of the courtroom with a small, dangerous calm. He had come to see the man who had taken his place in the valley brought low, to weigh for himself whether the law could deliver what his father's wrath never did. He was not a man moved only by rage. He was a man taught that certain blood accounts were a man's due. If the law would provide the head he desired, he would accept it. If not, he had his own reckoning. The morning after Fitzgerald's arrest, there was a quiet, a holding of breath in Cedar Falls. Men spoke in low tones about what would follow. Silas and Clara sat together on the cabin stoop and watched Mercy graze. They both knew that legal victory did not end everything. Legal process could untangle a public wrong, but there were private reckonings that law could neither touch nor heal. It was on such a morning that Vincent Kellerman rode up the valley, his horse prancing with the confidence of a man who expected to be seen. He wore no hostility toward Clara at first in his posture. His face was more complicated, riddled with expectation and a slow accumulation of hurt. He found Silas on the ridge and dismounted with the polite care of a man who knew how to present his anger as a social ritual. "Silas Boon," Vincent said without preamble, "you took a woman from her town. You have been a shadow here long enough to earn your name. I have come from the Kellerman place to speak about debts my father left." Silas watched him carefully. He had lived a long time in the company of men who weighed their honor by the loudness of their fists. He had also learned that not all acts of pugnacity asked for immediate blood. He had seen men attempt to settle what they could not bear in their chests by acting out in the hills. The mountain had taught him to look longer than the first strike. Clara stepped forward when Vincent's hand brushed the pommel, as though expecting the agitation to escalate. She had tied her hair back in a plain knot and wore the same rough dress that had made her blend in town. There was a firmness in her posture, and when she spoke, her voice was not the shy voice that had sat in the pew. It was the voice of someone who had stood up in court and had brought paper into the light. "Vincent Kellerman," she said, "this man has a life he is trying to live. He came to the town and took me from an auction to save me from being sold like an object. We came with evidence that ties Fitzgerald to wrongdoing. We have asked the law to do its work." "You would take a man's right to reckon?" Vincent asked, and the words were the old invocation, rights as inherited currency. "I would take something better," Clara replied. "I would take a life that does not measure itself in debts of blood. The law will act. If the law does not, then each man must decide what he does with his hands. But I ask you, as a woman who has been chosen and who has chosen, what would settling this with violence do for your family? Would it return what you lost? Or would it teach your son someday that men are to be measured by what they destroy?" Vincent's jaw hardened. For a moment he seemed on the verge of seizing the argument in his fist. Then his gaze flicked to Silas and found not an abused enemy, but a man with eyes that had seen too much for vanity. He had a hardness that hid a fear of what surrender might mean. "I have been taught to expect the mountain to answer me," he said finally. His voice was less loud and more tired than Clara had expected. "But perhaps I have also been taught that tradition is not the same as justice." Clara took a step closer and placed her hand on Vincent's forearm, an act that was at once bold and wholly human. "Merely because a thing has always been done does not make it right," she said. "You can choose what your family inherits. Choose mercy, not the fiction of honor." There was a long silence, the kind that keeps the world from wheeling away. Vincent's shoulders sagged as if some invisible sack had been set down there. The man who had been expecting to strike and be satisfied instead stood and slowly put his hand over his heart, as if sealing a vow not drawn with a pistol, but with a more exacting instrument. "I will not shoot him today," Vincent said finally.
I will bring this to the council and to Judge Harrison. I will see that the law has its time. He spoke it like a man making a difficult renunciation. In that moment, he accepted a reality that would cost him something more than the crude medicine of revenge. He would have to live with the memory of choosing the harder path, which often is the truer measure of courage. The concession did not mean all was healed. There would be days of hard talk in the Kellerman house. There would be men who would call Vincent a coward. There would be a test of whether the town could hold its own promises. But Clara's intervention had prevented the immediate spilling of blood and had pointed toward a resolution that kept law and conscience in conversation. Time moved forward with the slow, indifferent civility of seasons. The trial continued. Fitzgerald's defense attempted to discredit Jacob's ledger with claims of forgery and of men changing words after the fact. But Judge Harrison, steady, methodical, and not given to melodrama, grappled with the evidence and issued decisions that would be written down in the town's memory. Deputies took witness statements and compared handwriting, and the town sat in the heat of a moral turn, not entirely sure it wanted to see which side it would inhabit. When the day of reckoning came, Harold Fitzgerald was brought before the county court. Clara stood in the gallery with other witnesses. Sarah sat by her, hands white around the edge of her chair. The ledger's pages were displayed and read aloud. Judge Harrison presided with the careful gravity of a man who knew how much people relied on the clarity of ink and witness. Fitzgerald's expression when the verdict came down was like someone watching a building he had built be taken apart with the precise patience of millwrights. He had thought himself beyond the scouring of conscience, because he had made a place for himself where men traded favors and where paper served to steel the hands of men who would take more than coin. Now his name would be recorded beside the facts, and crucially, the town could no longer pretend not to know. He was convicted of his role in the plot that led to Thomas Wynn's death, and of the manipulations that had allowed him to hold sway over others. The sentence was not a short one. It was the kind of binding punishment our public systems pretend can repair relationship and deter future crimes. For many in town, it felt insufficient to the enormity of what had happened. For others, it was a beginning of accountability. Judge Harrison spoke in the sentencing of a town's need to accept the consequences of its silence as much as its misdeeds. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Falls began to rearrange itself. Men who had once thought themselves immune to ordinary moral law found their reputations cracking. Those who had been bought and sold, like Sarah Morrison, started to find small measures of dignity. Father Mackenzie preached about stewardship and the evil of owning another person, and at his sermons, people listened as if perhaps their own complacency needed confession. Silas and Clara rebuilt the parts of their life that had been strained by court and by gunfire. The cabin weathered the seasons and grew a new set of routines. More laughter at the dinner table, careful plans for winter stores, and most tenderly, a small cradle drawn in sketches and later carved by Silas's patient hands. The cradle was rough but well made, and Clara marked the first clean planes of wood with a ribbon of flourishes. It was their project, a sign that they had chosen to invest in a future rather than to remain bound to the old cycles of violence. Vincent Kellerman returned to his family and to the long conversations that have to do with re-education of the heart. He met with the judge and with Father Mackenzie, and sometimes with Silas himself. There were mornings where they worked side by side in a field planting corn, men who had once been enemies, now sharing the blunt labor of living. Vincent's father, old and gray, would come to the chapel and speak to people he had wronged. His voice, shameful but clear, was the awkward shape of a man trying to unmake injury. Silas's past did not disappear, nor did his guilt evaporate with Fitzgerald's arrest. He continued to keep watch over his hands and his temper. He admitted, on certain evenings when the moon lay like a silver coin over the ridge, to Clara that some nights the memory of his violence returned in ways that made him wake. But the quality of those nights changed. Where before they had been a solitary, smug affirmation that he could hurt to survive, now they were nights when he would feel the presence of regret and the desire to be better. Clara held him then, and the small domestic acts, the mending of a sleeve, the preparing of a warm broth, acted like torches that kept shadows at bay. When Vincent finally visited them on an autumn morning to offer atonement not in words but in labor, he cut wood for the cabin and fixed a fence with an unshowy humility. The exchange between the men was brief and honest. They shook hands in a way that was not triumphant but meant. It sealed not a piece of forgetting, but a piece of commitment to do better. One afternoon in late winter, a snow lay soft on the ridge and the town below held the brittle feel of a place that had survived a storm and rearranged itself by the work of honest people. Clara found herself in the doorway of the cabin, rubbing her belly with that odd new tenderness that arrives in the shape of growth. They had decided to try. In the quiet hours, the thought of a child had come to feel less like a risk and more like a necessary work.
She and Silas spent the afternoon preparing things they did not yet need: a small blanket with a pattern of pines and river stones, a cradle varnished with oils, a tiny carved spoon. They did not speak of what might be demanded by a world that could still be cruel. They simply did the things that build a household: mending, planning, reserving store. The mountain had taught them both about scarcity and about shaping what little one has into enough. At the edge of the cabin porch, a bell, smaller than the one in the town church, hung ready to be rung at dawn or at storms. Silas used it not as an alarm, but as a small instrument of ritual. He liked to ring it at day's end and watch the sound tilt the valley's air. He sometimes heard in the sound the echo of the chapel where he had first spoken the words that set their story into motion. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, he had said, and that sentence had been, in part, a confession that his life had been nearly undone by isolation. Now, years later, and with different burdens, the memory of that claim had changed. It was no longer only a cry of hunger. It had become the hinge on which he had turned toward life. 1 year after the chapel, on a spring morning painted with a clean light, the town gathered at the little church, not for an auction, but for a blessing. There was no need to restage the dramatic altar kiss of a year before. People had learned that what made a marriage enduring was the daily, unremarkable choice to be present. Judge Harrison, who had presided over more public reckonings in the past year than he had wished, stood in the doorway and watched the community gather. Silas and Clara walked in together, not as a spectacle, but as a part of a community that had been remade. They took their place among the pews with a quiet that had none of the frenzy of the chapel scene of a year prior. They had earned their place not by bravado, but by the slow accumulation of fidelity. After the blessing, friends came to the cabin to spend the day. There were pies on windowsills and the smell of coffee thick in the air. The cradle sat in the corner, ready with its blanket and the little spoon Silas had carved. The town, stitched together again by a slow and sometimes painful reckoning, had begun to lean more toward mercy and order than toward the old comforts of bought silence. Vincent Kellerman visited again, this time with a small gift, a carved cedar whistle for the child in waiting. He delivered it with a hand that no longer trembled with anger, but with a steady disposition to do better. "For the child that won't learn from us what was wrong," he said, a rare smile tugging his mouth, "but will learn from what we do now." Clara laughed then, a bright, uncomplicated sound. She took the whistle and hung it near the cradle. "They will learn," she said, "that the world can be remade, that men can be different." The years that followed were not miraculous. They were ordinary advances, routines altered by small kindnesses, sutures made by steady work. Clara gave birth in the house with a midwife's hands and Silas's steady presence. The child came to be called Anna, a name meaning grace, not chosen for sentimentality, but for the truth it carried. The cradle rocked as the first pale light unfolded each morning. There were nights of worry and days of joy, and the villagers learned to bring food and to watch over the newborn as if she were proof that the town could choose life. Silas watched his daughter sleep with an intensity that could have been superstition. He would press a finger to the cradle rail and marvel at how a small life could soothe a man's old terrors. He spoke to Anna often, in low, rough tones, promising her a world that would not be bought or sold, a world where law and mercy could walk together down the same road. Clara taught Anna the small domestic arts that had once been tools of survival and had become instruments of love. She taught her to mend a tear as carefully as one might repair a fence post, to fill a kettle without scalding a hand, and to read the seasons like a book. Silas taught Anna to recognize the smell of rain before it came, and to understand that the world was often more kind than one expected, and sometimes less so. They taught her together that courage takes many shapes. The town, in the same period, changed in ways that were not complete but were undeniable. The practice of auctioning a person's bondage was a memory now, discussed in church with the weight it deserved. Men who had once passed through courtroom doors with the comfortable arrogance of unaccountable wealth now learned that legal consequence could reach them. Father Mackenzie and Judge Harrison continued to speak in different tones about justice and mercy. Their voices became the twin pillars of a civic conscience. One evening, when Anna was old enough to sit in a small lap and listen to stories with wide eyes, Silas took the child out to the crest where the town lay like a low constellation below. The valley light shimmered and the mountain's wind bent the hair on his arm. Clara stood beside him, her hand warm in his.
I said I hadn't seen a woman in 10 years, Silas said, voice low, as if confessing a debt he'd once thought small. I meant it then, and I mean it now, but it is not the same meaning. Then I meant I had lived without kin or kindness. Now I say it in another way. I had not seen what my life could be without the hard, ordinary thing of sharing it. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. And now? She asked. Now, he answered, looking down at the town and at the cradle waiting in their home. I've learned that seeing a woman is not about absence or possession. It's about partnership. I haven't seen, well, I had not known until you, how life opens when you let people in. You taught me to change my ledger.
They came down from the ridge and into the quiet of their house, where the cradle slept and the kettle sighed. Silas carved a new spoon, while Clara stitched a small coverlet with a pattern of pines and river stones, and outside, the bell in their yard rang once, twice, a small sound to mark the ordinary grace of ordinary life. If one looks for the moment the town truly changed, it is difficult to name a single instant. The change arrived in small, repeated acts, men paying for what they had taken, people bringing bread to the widow, a father in a white collar learning to say, "I was wrong," in front of an audience large enough to make him embarrassed. It settled like a sunrise, slow and patient. In the end, the confession that had broken the chapel's hush, "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, was not erased but read anew. It had been a shock, yes, an act that had startled a town and forced a ledger to flip, but what it had become was a doorway. Through that doorway walked a woman who chose, and a man who learned to be chosen in return. Through it walked a judge who would use the law when it mattered, a marshal who learned the weight of oath, and a town that would, for the first time in many years, make its bargains less about coin and more about conscience." Years later, as Anna ran and the valley hummed with the familiar work of people staining their hands with honest labor, Silas would sometimes stand in the chapel doorway and think of the morning he spoke his truth. He would think of the noise it made and of the quiet life that had grown from that sound. He would often take Clara's hand then, not as a claim, but as a continuity of the life they'd built together. If you find yourself thinking of Cedar Falls or the ridge where Mercy grazed, remember that justice did not simply come because a man with a ledger was brought low. It came because a woman chose to carry a paper into the light, and because a man was willing to risk an old pride for something new. It came because a community bent, slowly and painfully, toward better habits. If this story has kept you by its fireside, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales of unlikely love and hard-won justice. The bell in the church still rings on Sundays, though its tone is softer now, less a tool of commerce and more a call to shared work. The cradle that was once a wooden promise now rocks with the small weight of a child's sleep. Silas keeps wood stacked by the door, and Clara keeps herbs drying in the windowsill. They have learned, both of them, how to convert the raw materials of a hard life into something tender. On a clear morning not long after Anna's first birthday, Vincent Kellerman came once more to the doorstep with an envelope in hand. It contained a small sum of money and a letter of apology already penned in a hand that had the honest roughness of a man who had done his own accountings. He left it by the gate and tipped his hat without speech.
It was a quiet confession and a true one. It cost him something to make it, and the cost was the point. People who like to say that frontier life is only about fists and fortunes are wrong. There was violence, yes, always a risk in places where law can be bought by influence, but there was also a long, grinding work of rebuilding. The measure of a man was no longer how quickly he could make his enemies disappear, but how he could learn to live with them, to alter his relations so that another generation would be spared. Silas and Clara taught Anna many things, but perhaps the single best lesson they taught together was this, that love and law are not enemies, but partners. One shapes the heart, the other shapes the public order that keeps small lives safe. Mercy, once the name of a mare and the tremulous hope of a man, had become a practice. Years after the bell in the chapel tolled for the first time at Silas's shocking confession, the town that had once bought and sold people like chattel was now a place that spoke, awkwardly and often with embarrassment, about the cost of silence. People came to the cabin on the ridge in the evenings to bring food or to ask advice on how to keep a new roof from letting in rain. They came not as supplicants begging for favors,
but as neighbors who had learned the value of tending one another. Clara would often stand at the window with Anna in her arms and watch the valley like a woman whose life had taught her the weight of choice. Silas would sit by the hearth and whittle spoons, and sometimes he would look up and tell a story of the chapel, of a line he had said and could never take back, and of the small and surprising thing that had happened when the town listened. They had come down from the mountain together, not because one had dragged the other out, but because one had asked and the other had chosen. The decade of absence that had defined Silas Boon had been replaced by a life of presence. The cradle that once was only a future promise had become a place of ordinary love and daily work. The ledger that once measured debts had been rebalanced by confession and the slow, careful application of justice. On quiet mornings, when the sun flung thin gold along the rungs of the cradle and the house settled in its breathing, they sometimes spoke of the old days as if they were ghosts that had been seen and invited to leave. They did not forget. They were not blind to the ways men could err, but they had chosen a long, patient way of living that refused the idea that the world must be a marketplace for human lives. And when Silas would stand at the edge of the ridge and look down at Cedar Falls, he would sometimes say, softly, as if keeping a secret with the wind, "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. Then he would laugh, a sound that had the rough edge of the hills and the warmth of a home. "I haven't," he would say, "because I had not known how much living there could be after grief.
But I have seen now, and what I see is enough." And Clara, standing beside him with a small hand curled in her fingers, would rest her head on his shoulder and answer without ceremony, "Then stay and keep seeing. We will make a life together that remembers why it matters to say the truth aloud." So they did. The mountain kept watch. The town learned slowly how to keep its accounts with honesty. And in the cabin, by the light of a small lamp, the cradle rocked, and the small, ordinary work of love continued, steady, deliberate, and enough.